Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Uh, Good evening, everyone. Dr. Muhammed Afzal P teaches courses in literary and cultural studies in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences. His research has been primarily concerned with the cultural forms and aesthetic practices of the left that mediates Kerala's experience of modernity. He is currently researching on melodrama, romance, and utopian desire in early Malayalam cinema. His areas of research interests include Malayalam cinema, intellectual and cultural history of the left in India, contemporary Indian English fiction, popular culture and popular politics, cultural studies in Asia, and language politics. We are glad to have him here amidst us. Thank you for joining us, sir, and welcome.
Yeah, thank you for that introduction, and I thank the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, IIT Guwahati, for this opportunity to talk about contemporary Indian English fiction in front of an audience which come from various parts of the country, and yeah, as part of this graduate research meet. Um, this is not a very well structured talk, but what I plan to do is to offer some reflections on contemporary Indian English fiction. And what I plan to do primarily is to talk about what actually contemporary Indian English fiction would mean in our context, especially when if we do an exercise like the one that A.K. Ramanujan proposed in is there an Indian way of thinking? We can see there are certain keywords, and depending on where we put the stress, we may have different answers. So I will start with a brief discussion of Indian writing in English from its early phase to maybe the recent times. And then I will move to a discussion of the question of English itself in the Indian context. Now, then along with that, there will be the question of I will be discussing some recent works from literary cultures that I'm more familiar with, and I'll make an argument about how these writings and these writings in translation in a way reconstitute what we understand by not only contemporary Indian English fiction, but also this idea of India itself, perhaps. Yeah. So we know that Indian writing in English has been around for quite a long period of time by now, and even though it is with the publication of Salman Rushdie's Midnight Children in 1980, critics from across the world, and some critics even describing it as a continent finding its voice finally. Yeah, this publication of this work, in a way, Indian writing in English emerged on the global stage. While while this was one of the first works to receive such a global attention, and later winning the Booker Prize would also consolidate that. There have been other writers who were writing in English, and they were also dealing with questions, certain questions, um, and they would also talk about questions related to language and questions of authenticity, etc. Yeah. So we are familiar with the statement that Raja Rao made in his introduction to, uh, in his forward to Kantapura, where he was talking about the alienation that he felt in terms of the language, right? How he has to express um, in a language that is not one's own, the sensibilities that are one's own. And in many of these writings, in English, we would see certain themes which are related to, let's say, nationalism, national identity, partition, questions of tradition and modernity, and those kind of questions. And then there also emerges this question of audience. Who are these writers writing for? Is it for an Indian audience, or is it for a global audience, especially at a time when English was seen as a legacy of colonialism and not a language that everybody shares. This would definitely spark a debate between the Indian writers in English and those who were the Indian writers who were writing in what is called bhashas or vernaculars, where the writers who were writing in the regional languages, or the so-called vernaculars, were seen as more authentic. When they were seen as dealing with questions of more regional questions, and questions which are connected with questions of modernity in those places. But yeah, so Sudipto Kaviraj actually makes this argument about how modern Indian literature undertakes the function of what social theory did in Europe. I'm not going into that debate. What I want to indicate here is this divide that emerged between the Bhasha writers and the Indian writers in English in the early period, about and this had to do with this question of the language and questions of authenticity. Now, this and at this point of time, let's also look at how some of the critics were looking at this question. Let me read some parts from Meenakshi Mukherjee's essay, The Anxiety of Indianness, where she's talking about these English writers, English writing in India. Sorry, Indian writing in English. Yeah. So where she says, I quote, "In the English text of India, there may be a greater pull towards a homogenization of reality and essentializing of India, a certain flattening out of the complicated and conflicting contours, the ambiguous and shifting relations that exist between individuals and groups in a plural community." And later on in the essay, she would also talk about the themes that I have already mentioned, the themes which are discussed in the writings of those who wrote in English. So she says their themes remained predictably pan-Indian, and I quote, "The national movement, partition of the country, the clash between tradition and modernity, faith and rationality, or similar time-worn cliches of East-West confrontation, disintegration of the joint family, exploitation of women, etc." And she says, in this project, they were in a way defining Indian concerns as against local or regional issues. So the key point for us is how writers who were writing in English in earlier times, how for them the question of nation was inescapable, whether the audience was within the country or outside. So here, one of the concerns or contestation was, of course, regarding again how who can capture our reality better. Is it the regional writers or the English writers? Now, Rushdie, when he put together this vintage book of Indian writing 1947 to 1997, he wrote this way, I quote, "The prose writing, both fiction and non-fiction, created in this period," by which he means 1947 to 97, "by Indian writers working in English is proving to be a stronger and more important body of work than most of what has been produced um, in the 16 official languages of India, the so-called vernacular languages during the same time. And indeed, this new and still burgeoning Indo-Anglian literature represents perhaps the most valuable contribution India has yet made to the world of book. This was the claim that Rushdie made, and he also talked about this question of the parochialism from which the vernacular literature suffered. Um, now, yeah, so now what happens here is that while all the other writings are from all other writings are regional, uh, including literature in Hindi, which is one of the languages spoken by a lot of people in our country in terms of the percentage of speakers. It is the highest, right? So so even, yeah, so how all these languages would be only regional parochial, whereas English would represent Indianness in a way. And it's a very peculiar kind of situation for writers who are writing in English. Now, writers who came after this generation of Rushdie, and the writers who were located in the diaspora, in their writings also, we would see concern with a kind of essentialized Indian identity. Um, so again, let me quote from Meenakshi Mukherjee, where she says, I quote, "There is no getting away from the burden of India if you want to write in English." And she goes on to say that India may be a discursive space for the writer of Indian origin living elsewhere. But those living and writing here, particularly the Bhasha novelist, would seldom make figurative use of something as amorphous as the idea of India, because she or he has a multitude of specific and local experiences to turn into tropes and play with. Of course, Meenakshi Mukherjee is writing in the late 90s, and at that point of time, she's intervening in this debate between Indian writers in English and Bhasha writers, and also like how diasporic writers were talking about diasporic writers who were writing in English were talking about nation, all these grand themes. Now, this is a moment for us to now come back to this question of our contemporary. What constitutes our contemporary period, and what is it characterized by? Now, we can say that contemporary is of course a logic of periodization, where maybe we can take the post 1989 as our contemporary period. Many social scientists would talk about contemporary in terms of post 1989, because there were various kind of developments that were happening in our socio-political and cultural lives. Now, the question to ask is, if Indian writing in English and Indian novel in English, if they had the function of representing the idea of nation and also constructing a certain kind of Indianness, what does the contemporary Indian English fiction, what does it do, and also what is its character? Now, if we look at the course descriptions or syllabus of many universities where this course, contemporary Indian English fiction, is offered, we will mostly see again writings of people, writers who are writing primarily in English. We may not come across Indian writing in English translation much. For that, there will be a separate course: Indian writing in English translation, or modern Indian writing, or comparative Indian literature, etc. Where, of course, English would be a linked language. But if we look at some of the recent developments, one can see how this modern Indian, how these regional writings through translation have changed the face of Indian writing. So this time, as you must be aware, when um, the the shortlist for the JCB Literature Prize came out, um, the all the five shortlisted novels were originally written in languages other than English. Two Urdu novels, one Malayalam, one Nepali, and one from Bengali. And eventually, an Urdu novel won the prize. Right? And this is perhaps the third or fourth time that a translated novel is winning this prize. And um, literary festivals, literary prizes, they have their own politics, but at the same, and the market has its own logic. And even even if we keep all these things in mind, what I want to highlight here is how in recent times we see a lot of proliferation of writings from all these uh, regional languages, and what is it doing? Let me come to that in a while. So when this shortlist came out, N. Kalyan Raman, himself a translator, wrote an article in which he argued that perhaps Indian writing in English translation is becoming the new phase of Indian writing in English, and Indian writing in English, as we know it, is losing ground to writings which are coming out, writing which are coming from this canon of Indian writing in English. One of the reasons that he points out is that how much of this, how much of these writings are coming from metropolitan elite backgrounds, and how the concerns and the narrative concerns of which are often steeped in elite concerns, whereas um, the writings in translation, they deal with issues which are closer home, and they deal with issues of caste, class, sexuality, gender, etc. And now if we look at this, this kind of a proposition that is made in 2022, and the kind of assertion that Rusty made in 1997, in 25 years, we can see how this the so-called parochialism, or these regional concerns would come to the center stage in Indian English fiction, and through this act of translation. And this is where I want to bring this question of cultural politics. Um, Here, by cultural politics, I am not going to talk about the cultural politics of translation. We are all aware of the politics of translation, what is involved, when we translate a text from one language to the other. Spivak and many others have written about this politics and ethics of translation. And we have seen numerous articles on what is lost and gained in translation. Um, what I'm trying to, again, Kalyan Raman in his article also says how the rise of Indian writing in English, with the success of Rusty and some of the other later writers, also in a strange way contributed to the revival of modern Indian literature in translation. There have been various government bodies, Sahitya Academy, and then organizations like Katha would translate some of the works from various Indian languages, but it was a very slow process. In the last few years, we see big publishing houses taking an interest in translating writings from Indian languages to English. And Minnie Krishnan was formerly with Oxford University Press, and before that with Macmillan. She has played a very important role in this, in bringing a lot of translations into a lot of regional literature into English translation. So here is it, and of course now with this, with the setting up of various awards and the translated works winning awards, there is of course an impetus to translate many of these writings. But is that the only factor that is helping, translation and thereby redefining contemporary Indian English fiction? Here, I touched upon earlier briefly on this question of the cultural politics, right? So the consensus around nationalism was challenged perhaps by late 80s and early 90s, and it was also the time when there was this crisis within humanities and also in English studies in India. Along with that, there was um, a lot of other changes which were happening, and because of which many people were entering public culture. Many people were entering sites of modernity, like institutes of higher education, and there was also this emergence of cultural politics around questions of caste, sexuality, and things like that. Now, to illustrate this point, let me take this example of one Malayalam novel called Puletara by a Dalit writer called Paul Chirakarod. This was translated from Malayalam by Catherine Tangam and published by Oxford University Press in 2019. This was a novel which was written in 1964. This novel was written in 1964, and at that point of time briefly discussed. But this novel was despite being the first Dalit Christian novel and talking about various issues of the oppression that the Dalit Christians in Kerala faced. In 2012, when the Oxford University Press brought out an anthology of Dalit literature in Malayalam, some parts of the novel was translated as part of that anthology. Now, what happens at that point of time is that one of the editors, Professor Dasan, had a copy of this novel, but the last few pages were missing. And now locating this book was huge task. Like they had to go into various libraries, and it's only after that they could locate it, because this was not a text that was available. Now, what happens is that because of the Dalit cultural politics across the country, and particularly in the South Indian states, in the last couple of decades at least, there have been various anthologies in translation. The anthology, Alphabet Insight by Satyanarayana and Susi Tharu, and then the Oxford anthology, and that actually creates a condition for the translation of a text like Pulayatara. So this cultural politics around the question of caste, gives an afterlife in a different sense to this text. Now, after this translation was published, now we have a new edition of this book coming out from this came out from a leading publishing house in Kerala, in Malayalam, the Malayalam edition itself. Similarly, various other questions around cultural identity also gave way to more translations. And at the same time, I'm also not discounting the fact that in contemporary Indian fiction written in English also, we would see some of these concerns emerging, whether it is the question of gender or sexuality or even caste, or the question of tribal identity. In what is called the chick lit, or even that's popular literature, we would see some of these concerns expressed. I'm not saying that it is the exclusive preserve of literature translated from regional languages. And I'm also thinking about Hansta Sovendra Shekhar's very beautiful book, The Adivasi Will Not Dance, a text which retains various traces of the Sandal culture and the language also in various ways, how yeah, this in English, and then this would articulate certain questions related to tribal identity in contemporary India. Um, Similarly, some of the other writings that I will briefly now talk about some writings from Malayalam and some other writings from Tamil. But before that, briefly let me come to this question of English. We now know that is English now occupies a different kind of position in contemporary India. While there have been all kind of debates around English, and we have also touched upon some of them. Now, at one level, we talk about English as the language of business, English as the language of globalization and things like that. And then even in the popular writings, or in the very popular fiction of the writers like Chetan Bhagat, we would see this aspiration for English. Right now, while all these questions are there, what is important for our discussion at this point of time is how various communities in India who may have a different or a distinct relationship with the so-called mother tongue or the dominant languages in various regions would think of English as more emancipatory. And this is again connected with questions of cultural politics. For instance, many Dalit writers would say that English is more important. And Rita Kotari, in an article a few years ago titled Caste in a Casteless Language, would talk about how how English translations from Gujarati would bring these questions of cultural identity in the context of Gujarat. Similarly, yeah, so there is more desire for English, and there is so, and in a way, there have been also questions of in this divide between the so-called pan-Indian English versus the regional languages. Again, many of the distinct ways of life, and also the diversity of the dominant Indian language is also subsumed. So there emerges a different relationship with English. Now, if we look at another text from Malayalam, which was again recently translated and shortlisted for the JCB Prize, Valli, by I forgot the name of the author, but yeah, the translator is Jayasri Kalathil. And in an interview, she says that my task is not to reproduce the existing canon in the source language. So what happens here is that she is not merely translating works which are canonical in Malayalam, but rather through translation, through this very possibility of translation, a new canon emerges. This Valli, in fact, I came across this book only when it was shortlisted for JCB Prize, and this was not a novel which was very well discussed in Malayalam, to the best of my knowledge. And this is set in the Wayanad district of Kerala, and it talks about the migration from other parts of Kerala and how it contributes to the destruction of the way of life of the tribals of Wayanad, and how how the development projects would cause a lot of damage to the environment in the tribal areas of Wayanad. And this novel, and in the original Malayalam, many parts are also written in the Paniya language. When the Paniya it's a tribe in Wayanad, and when they talk in this language, it is written this. Now, this is now this work is translated into English, and then in a way it would become part of the canon of Indian writing in English, especially through through the shortlisting of this award. Now there are some other writers like Vinoy Thomas, coming from the Kannur district of Kerala, and one of his novels has been recently translated by the original is called Puttu, and Ant Hill is the name of the translation, and his first novel called Karikotakari is again coming out from Penguin very soon. This novel, which is going to come out very soon, again talks about the question of caste within Christianity, and how, like set in a context of migration from southern Kerala to this northern Kerala. But again, what I'm trying to argue is that all these concerns which emerge from cultural politics, questions related to caste and identity and things like that, or environment, which are in a way very local concerns, they now enter into English, and through that, the very idea of a canon in Malayalam itself also gets destabilized. If we look at many of the titles which are coming out, they are not necessarily of the established writers, while their writings are also coming out, but many of these new kind of writers, or what we can maybe following Raymond Williams, maybe we can even call them emergent writings. These writings are coming out in English translation. Then now let me also briefly talk about some writings which are emerging from Tamil Nadu, especially the southern districts of Tamil Nadu, and which is called the Karisal region or the Black Soil region. Recently, there have been some works such as the collection Along with the Sun, Stories from Tamil Nadu's Black Soil Region. This was originally published in Tamil in 1984 and edited by K. Rajanarayanan. And this was translated in 2021 by Padma Narayanan and published by Harper. Then there have been translations of Pumani's Vekkai, which was translated by N. Kalyanaraman in 2019. This novel was originally written in 1984. Then there have been all these other novels coming out from Karisal region in English translation. So now, why do we see many such novels coming out in English translation? One of the reasons is again issues which are emerging from the specific context of Tamil Nadu, in the context of questions around Tamil identity, questions around caste, and also developments which are happening in other fields. For instance, the emergence of Dalit cinema in Tamil Nadu. So, for instance, this Heat was made into a Tamil film recently. Yeah. So overall, what we can see is that because of the changing role of English in contemporary India, and because of the way in which translation has been perceived and also facilitated by various funding agencies, publishers, the market, and academics, etc., one can say that this idea of Indian English fiction is no longer different from modern Indian literature also. So, or we cannot make a divide between Indian writing in English and Indian writing in English translation, and this has to do with this question of the questioning of this idea of an essential idea of Indianness as well. Yeah. So yeah, I think I will stop here, and if there are some questions, maybe I can further elaborate some of the points. Thank you.
If anybody has any questions, they can just go ahead, unmute themselves, and ask the question.
Hello, Afzal. Adib
Yes.
here.
Okay. Yeah.
Uh, so I wanted to ask, how does the logic of capital dictate the revival of something like a marginalized literature like Dalit literature or Bhasha, let's say Dalit literature or feminist literature or tribal literature for that matter.
Yeah.
I mean, it
Um,
is internally contradicting the logic. Yeah, yeah.
yeah. So maybe instead of capital, maybe I would use the word market here in this particular context where, yeah, definitely market also, in a way, if there is a market for all these writings, right? Publishers would be interested in bringing out all these writings. And, the market also in many ways likes diversity. That's something that is known to all of us. But what I'm saying is, sometimes all these developments can also have a kind of disruptive power, if not in the long run, at least in the short run. So now, if we look at the Dalits' relationship with English, one can say that English is, of course, the language of colonialism and all that, and how can you use that? But the discussion has been that, but when when the other languages are equally oppressive, when the other languages are casteist, and when the other language, yeah, what is wrong in embracing something like English, right? So similarly, all these other writings also, um, I mean, writings which are around questions of other identities, whether gender, all those things. They Yeah, so this is not like a market determining everything, but rather, as I've been trying to argue, it is also the other concerns then interacting with the logic of market.
We have a
Good
question
evening.
from Rajita. Yes, unmute and ask the question.
Yes. Hi, Afzal. Good evening. Thank you very much for a wonderful talk. In fact, the your point about how the entry of these less discussed texts in Malayalam get more visibility in English is destabilizing the canon of Malayalam is a very interesting point, and it actually set me thinking because I never thought in that way. I was more concerned about Dalit writing and tribal writing where the subaltern subject is being translated and there are so many other mediations in the process. So the I mean, it goes back to Spivak's question: Can the subaltern speak? So I have two examples, two texts in mind. One is C.K. Jano's Mother Forest. I have never seen the Malayalam version of it. I've only seen one English version, which is there in Sahitya Academy. And I've read a paper about it written by Professor Meena T. Pillai about how the subaltern subject is being museumized, especially when it comes to the language of the tribe. Similarly, another text I have in mind is Mailamma's biography, how a subaltern subject is completely reduced and picturized in a different way that even the subaltern does not know, how they are being translated to the wider audience. So isn't there a problem there? I would like to know your thoughts on this issue.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you for the question. And the first one, the observation, it's not actually my observation, like in the sense this Jayasri Kalathil was making this
Oh,
remark that how she sees this, that her task is not to recreate the canon of Malayalam literature in another language, but maybe even destabilize it back home. Yeah. Having said that, this question of the politics or ethics of translation, especially when we translate subaltern text. By maybe translators who come from or maybe a dominant communities. That is very much there. It's a very important question. And in the case of C.K. Janu, for instance, it is a translation which is happening twice, perhaps, because she is
yes,
telling her story to Bhaskaran, and
yes,
while we would see a lot of elements of the Adivasi language in the Malayalam original, but quite a lot is also lost while in translating it into a language like Malayalam itself. This this problem is definitely there. But what I see is that again, some of these translations came out much earlier, and especially Janu's translation. But maybe because of the changing, now we have perhaps, and in some of the discussions on translation, we would see that how people come into translation out of passion, not necessarily because of expertise even. And now, of course, there are all these rewards in the form of awards, and if your translation wins an award, there are monetary benefits, but also other kind of recognition. But I would I feel that at least in the present, in some of the translations that I have seen, there is an attempt to take into account the positionality of the translator, and also not to, now of course at one level there is cultural politics, and then at another level, as Adibu was asking, there is also the demand, or the demand of the market also. So in this process, do we end up again exoticizing the regional writings, or these communities, the way the diasporic writers or even Indian writers in English who were earlier writing, they were accused of presenting this in an essential manner. That's where I feel that some of these translations actually do justice to the diversity in terms of the language, and in terms of also the culture. I mean, this is again a provisional response, and this question has been around for a long period of time, right? So I'm just maybe I'll reflect further on this. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Good evening, sir. Am I audible?
Yes.
Sir, actually, you talked about the cultural politics involved in translations and how that actually dismantled this canon of Kerala literature. That we are having these kinds of books also in English translations. But I am actually doing research in Dalit female writings from Kerala. So when I was searching for my primary text, it was too difficult for me to find a text in English translation. All of these texts were written in regional language, and I think writing in English, it has something to do with uh, who has the access to this English language, and it has something to do with class too. So what is your take on that? And if it's very necessary that you should actually write in English so that you can speak to the global audience, and you can actually bring these issues into the global world. So that is very important, that you have to write these kinds of things in English language. But who has this kind of an access to English language, and who is privileged to get the kind of knowledge regarding all these things, and who is ready to publish, and who is ready to translate for these women who are from the lower class communities, especially Dalit women from Kerala? So what is your take on that, sir?
Yeah, so of course, English is still the preserve of the elite. In a sense, it is the preserve of a privileged few. But at the same time, many of the subaltern communities in this country would relate differently with English now, at least in the last couple of decades. We know about the Dalits, many of the Dalit singers who would advocate for the use of English, right? And if we again look at some of the recent discussions on caste also, like a book published in the US would talk about the question of caste as the paradigm to talk about race. Whether it is apt or not is a different question, but it was actually some of the debates which were in the regional languages around questions of caste entering English, that made the cultural politics around caste much stronger, is what I would believe. So in this regard, we can perhaps think of the Durban Conference on Racism and Xenophobia, where representatives from India participated, and what was the impetus that it gave to this question of caste, right? So I would see that, I mean, one of the arguments that those who advocate for English would say is that at least you can acquire it. English, while there is definitely the question of inequality in terms of access, but relatively there is more possibility. That would be one kind of response to that.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
And in this regard, I mean, there have been some recent works on how even the aspiration for English among the lower class or lower caste groups have been seen by others, right? So Leah Matthew in her recent work would talk about aspiration shaming, right? Like in Kerala, we would occasionally hear all these remarks that why do they want to send their children to English medium schools when they don't have money for their basic necessities. And this aspiration to learn English is often looked down upon. See, here my point is not to take one side or the other. I'm not saying that English has all the answers, but what I'm saying is that how certain groups would relate to this language in the contemporary context.
Hi, am I audible? Yeah, so
Yes,
my
please.
question is related to the emancipatory part of the language. So when you say that English is as emancipatory, one direct way which I can think of this relationship is via the writings of Miranda Fricker's epistemic injustice and testimonial injustice and hermeneutical injustice. So sometimes languages are rooted into the cultures which create conceptual vacuums, and translations, takes you out of that conceptual and hermeneutical vacuum. So what are the other considerations in which we can think of this emancipatory part of language, and especially considering the cultural aspects of English as well?
Yeah. I think it was yeah, I think, yeah, James Joyce once talked about how for him being an outsider of the English society helped him to use the language in a particular way, in a very innovative way, and also to talk about in how this outsider status helped him. See, the Indians who have been using English, they at one level they had this burden of conveying something which is more native in a supposedly foreign tongue. But many of the Indian writers, whether it is Rushdie or Arundhati Roy, many of these writers have again played with the language, or as Rita Kotari would talk about, many writers would also chutnify English, right? So I do not know whether we can think of the English anymore. We of course talk about Englishes, right? And then um, in many cases we also would see a lot of words from other languages entering English, whether it is in translations from various languages, or I'm talking particularly about the Indian context, or even original writings. We would see a lot of the words which are not merely for the local flavor, but also because they carry other kind of connotations. So I would want to believe that languages are quite often very open, right? Especially some languages are more open towards improvisation. That's what I would think of this situation.
Do we have any more questions from the participants? If we do not have any more questions, we would proceed towards the end of the talk. On behalf of the organizing committee of Graduate Research Meet, I would like to thank Dr. Muhammad Afzal for hosting this talk, agreeing to host this talk.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, sir.
Yeah, it was a pleasure. It was a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
The participants can leave the meeting.
Yeah, so I'll just log out. Thank you.
Thank you.